Good evening. My name is Jim Wilson, and I want to welcome you to one of the 10 webinars that we are holding on the science, the policy, the politics, and the medicine of the COVID-19 endemic. I'm currently a faculty member at the Perlman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also a proud alum of Albion College. This webinar series is actually sponsored by the Lisa and James Institute of Medicine at Albion College. So before we get started, I'd like to review with you the format for this evening. After our featured speaker makes a few introductory comments, I will introduce several students from Albion who will lead a discussion with our speaker on issues related to COVID-19. I want to also remind the audience that we will invite members of the audience to submit questions, and I will keep an eye on any incoming questions and try to get them out to our speaker. So it's a distinct pleasure tonight to introduce Andrew Lo, who's at MIT. He's the Charles E. and Susan T. Harris Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's also director of the MIT Laboratory for Financial Engineering and PI on the MIT Computer Science and AI Laboratory. He's also affiliated with the MIT Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Andrew received his BA in economics from Yale University and a Ph.D. in economics from Harvard University. And from 1984 to 1988, he was assistant and then associate professor of finance at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. And to our loss, he regrettably was recruited to MIT in 1988, where he has been ever since. And really, I think it's going to bring a very important perspective on the impact of COVID. And I'm going to pass it over to Andrew, and thank you for being here this evening with us.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Wilson for that very generous introduction and for inviting me to this wonderful series. And I want to thank Albion College for supporting it. And it's really a pleasure and honor for me to be included with so many elite scholars, policymakers, and business leaders. I'm particularly honored because as an economist, I have no healthcare background to speak of. And yet, even I, an outsider to the biomedical world, understand the kind of pioneering contributions that Dr. Wilson has made. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in a few minutes because it turns out that it has some pretty interesting financial implications. With that disclaimer in mind, I want to explain to all of you how I got interested in healthcare issues and why I'm so keen to interact with the students and other participants on tonight's call. I got interested in healthcare issues really for personal reasons. A number of years ago, friends and family were dealing with cancer of various different types. And I quickly realized that as an economist, I had pretty much zero to contribute to their health and well-being. And it was very frustrating for me. I spent a lot of time trying to understand what they were going through, and then started reading a little bit more about how cancer drugs are developed and ultimately delivered to patients. And through that process, something really remarkable emerged from my perspective as an economist, which is that finance plays a big role in healthcare, sometimes too big a role, in my opinion. And I'll give you an example. When my mother was battling with non-small cell lung cancer, I was introduced to a very successful biotech company that was in the midst of developing a number of cancer therapeutics, one of which might have helped her. And so I was privileged to meet with the chief scientific officer of the company, and he invited the chief financial officer to join us because he thought that it would be useful to have a translator. And so I asked the both of them what I thought was a relatively innocent question. I asked them, does your source of financing have any influence on your scientific agenda? Because I was quite interested in that agenda, given that there were a number of different projects, one of which might have helped my mother had it been elevated to a higher level. The chief scientific officer looked at his CFO, shook his head ironically, and turned back to me and said, influence? Our financing drives our scientific agenda. Now, as an economist, I get it. You have to pay for stuff. But from the perspective of the son of a dying patient, I have to tell you that I was really outraged. What does stock market volatility, interest rates, and Fed policy have to do with whether you should treat cancer via angiogenesis inhibitors or immunotherapy? Nothing. And yet those kinds of factors end up driving the scientific agenda of these companies. Now, as I said, I'm no biomedical expert, but shouldn't the science be driving the financing rather than the other way around? And so that's what really led me to start thinking about applying the principles of financial engineering, which is my field of expertise, applying mathematical and statistical models to investments, risk management strategies, financial stability, and those kinds of issues, applying those very same principles to drug development to see if there are better ways of financing therapeutics. And one of the issues that I think we're going to talk about later tonight is how you may be able to use those strategies to deal with the financing of vaccines for infectious diseases like COVID-19. Part of the challenge is that the economics of vaccines are very different than the economics of other fields. And I quickly learned that as I started trying to apply these principles and getting collaborators in the biomedical field to work with me to try to understand how it works. So one of the first areas that I looked at was rare diseases. Now, by way of background, the rare disease, the Orphan Drug Act of 1983 defines a rare disease as any disease that affects 200,000 patients or less in the US. And so examples of rare diseases are hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, and so on. Now, you might think 200,000 patients or less, and some of these diseases have maybe 1,000 patients worldwide, not a very important area, right? Well, it turns out that actually there are over 7,000 different rare diseases, and over 30 million Americans suffer from one or more of these diseases. So it actually affects a large number of people, more than the number of people afflicted with cancer. Now, the way that I got interested in rare diseases was because of a remarkable property of theirs, not a biological or a healthcare property, but a financial property. And the property is this: the success or failure of any one rare disease therapeutic is generally unrelated to the success or failure of another one. Now, that's not always true, but for many of them, it is approximately true, mainly because they're so different and there are so many different mechanisms for interfering with these diseases or helping individuals to overcome them that you can actually put together a portfolio of a number of these diseases, and they're going to be mutually uncorrelated. It's this aspect that caught my attention because as a financial economist, I focus on the correlations. You've all heard of the principle of diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, the idea is exactly to try to keep that kind of correlation low among your different investments so that when one fails, it doesn't affect the others. And this is a really remarkable property of rare diseases. To give you an example of why it's so unusual and remarkable, I often ask my MBA students, who I teach, business students looking to make a career in various different industries, I ask them a very simple challenge. Can you list 5 different financial investments that are mutually uncorrelated? So any kind of financial investments, stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities, anything that trades on a financial exchange. Can you put together for me a portfolio of 5 of them that are mutually uncorrelated? And students try pretty hard. I've actually asked my faculty colleagues as well. Can't do it. It is very difficult to find financial investments that are mutually uncorrelated. But I can come up with a dozen rare disease therapeutic companies whose success or failure has nothing to do with each other. And so putting together a portfolio of rare diseases is one way to actually reduce the risk, increase the potential reward, and therefore draw more capital into the investment space. This kind of portfolio approach is something that I've written about, and I've done a number of studies, both on the academic side and now in the commercialization world. We've actually implemented these, and it does seem to actually reduce the risk, increase the returns, and get investors more interested in this. Now, let me talk about the medical side, because obviously the bottom line is, what is this going to do for patients? And I'll just very quickly tell you about two different companies. One company is a company that I wrote a case study about called Agilis Therapeutics. They had developed a gene therapy, which is a particular technique where you take a virus, you insert a particular gene in it, and then you inject the virus in a patient, and then that virus takes that gene and replaces the defective gene that happens to be causing the disease in the patient. So in the case of Agilis Therapeutics, it was a disease known as L-amino acid decarboxylase deficiency. It's a big mouthful, and for short, it's AADC. This AADC deficiency prevents infants from producing dopamine in the brain. And without dopamine, you end up having all sorts of difficulties, but the most obvious of that is difficulty with motor functions. You're not able to move your arms up. Babies do not roll over. They don't stand up. They can't move, crawl. It's a terrible, terrible disease. And most parents aren't even aware of it for the first few months, because typically babies don't do a whole lot but cry and eat. And so, you don't think anything of it until you realize that your infant is not acting normally, not raising his or her head, moving arms, and so on. So this particular disease was diagnosed years ago, and a Taiwanese doctor by the name of Paul Hu realized that if you inserted the correct gene that does allow the infant to produce dopamine, and you inject it in the brain, a one-time injection, that could actually help. And this was done a few years ago in Taiwan in a small clinical trial. And what they found was absolutely remarkable. They found that after this injection, just days afterwards, they could actually measure an increase in dopamine levels. And within weeks and months, the infants started to move. And a couple of years afterwards, after they followed these patients, they were walking. They weren't totally normal, because obviously they hadn't learned how to walk until much later in life than the typical infant. But without a doubt, they were actually able to engage in a variety of motor functions that AADC deficient babies typically have not been able to. So that's one example of this new therapy, this ability to correct genetic mutations and see therapeutic benefits. The second company I want to mention is a company known as Spark Therapeutics. This is a company that was started with the goal of helping patients that suffer from another rare condition called Leber's congenital amaurosis. Causes blindness in children. And with this gene therapy, which is a one-time injection to the back of the eye, vision is actually restored. The lame shall walk, the blind shall see. These are things that are typically written in religious tracts, but it's happening. It's happening today. And in both cases, actually, there's a particular virus that was used to do this, known as an adeno-associated virus number 9, AAV9. That virus was developed in Dr. James Wilson's lab. So this is an amazing therapy that has now restored these kinds of important abilities in children that would have had lifelong suffering. A really remarkable set of events. And the key is that the financing now, using the right kind of structures, we can actually do some amazing things to bring investors to the table, as well as scientists and clinicians. So I want to just wrap up by pointing out that, finance has been used for all sorts of purposes. But finance, to most of us, is a means to an end, not an end unto itself. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game if we don't let it. And so if we bring together scientists, clinicians, financiers, policymakers, we will then be able to take advantage of all of these great therapies and be able to get them to patients faster, better, and eventually cheaper. Thank you, and look forward to the conversation with the students.
Great, thank you, Professor Lowe. Well, great. We'll move on to the Q&A, and first I'm going to introduce 4 students from Albion College. We'll start with Michaela.
Hi, I'm Michaela. I'm a senior from Shelby Township, Michigan, and I'm a biology major with a Spanish minor, and I'm a member of the Wilson Institute.
Great. John, you can join us.
Hi, my name is John Hesley. I'm a junior from Charlotte, Michigan. I'm a finance major with a communications minor, and I'm a member of the Gerstacker Institute.
Great. Kurt?
Hi there, my name is Kurt Jolly. I'm a senior from Chelsea, Michigan. I'm a member of the Wilson Institute and a double major in economics and management and biology.
And Cam?
Hello, everyone. My name's Cam. I am a junior here at Albion. I am a finance major with a religious studies minor, and I am from Boyne City, and I'm also a member of the Gerstacker Institute.
Great. So why don't we get started? I'll pass it over to the students. Michaela.
So I have a question about, so due to the pandemic, many companies had to find new ways to make their businesses run, primarily online. And just as an example of the changes, like some companies found that when their IT departments were shifted online, they actually found increased productivity, and they're considering making these changes permanent. So I was wondering if you think this will cause companies to reallocate their funding, and if this would overall cause an economic shift, like overall in the country.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Without a doubt, the entire global economy is going to change because of COVID-19. And I think you've just given one example, which is that the whole idea of the workplace has shifted. You know, my older son is out in the Bay Area as a tech entrepreneur, and he tells me that a number of the tech companies have told their employees that they can actually work from home indefinitely. So it's not just till the end of the year or the end of the pandemic. Their view is that things have gone so well that actually they're perfectly happy to let people work at home. And what they're going to do is reduce the amount of office space that they use. You know, ironically, it used to be the case that it was very prestigious for you to be in a position at a company where you didn't have to come into the office, you could work from home. What's going to happen over the course of the next few months is that the real prestige jobs are going to be where you get to go to an office and spend time with your colleagues. So absolutely, I think the social dynamics will change, the economics will change, and I think we're going to become more productive. Ultimately, we still need human contact. That's one aspect of Homo sapiens. We are social animals, so that won't go away. But I think the way that we organize the workplace will change completely. And as a result, you're going to see some efficiencies, but you're also going to see some difficulties. For example, real estate companies, the various WeWork kind of places that have launched are going to have a hard time now because they have a lot of commercial real estate that will not be as productive as it used to be.
Dr. Lowe, I have a question as well, sort of pertaining to the workforce. As far as, especially in recent years, I know that sort of automated machines and sort of computers are trying to, or companies are trying, because they're more efficient, companies are desperately trying to sort of implement those instead of needing actual human interaction. So how much of those can you see sort of that have developed in coronavirus becoming mainstays within the country? And how could you see that is sort of affecting the the lower stature, more tedious jobs that are being replaced by machines?
Yeah, so this is really a broader question that actually people were asking even before the pandemic. And I think your point is well taken that effectively the pandemic will have accelerated that process. So I don't think we've really fully worked out the implications. My former colleague, Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT, now at Stanford, and Andrew McAfee, they've written about the impact of automation on the workplace. And one of the things that they point out is that it is absolutely the case that the jobs that involve the least amount of specialized skills, those are the ones that are going to be automated first, just because they're the low-hanging fruit. And so, for example, once we are able to have fully driverless automobiles, autonomous vehicles, one of the first industries that's going to get hit is the trucking industry. And if you think about how many truck drivers there are out there and what they're going to need to do to figure out how they can retrain and get jobs in the new economy, that's going to cause some tremendous disruption. And this is not the kind of thing that'll happen over the course of 10, 20 years, so that gradually people will be able to figure out, how to retrain. It's going to happen, within the next, 3 or 4 years, once these driverless car technologies become bulletproof. So I think that this is a real problem and that we need to work on, and I don't think we're paying enough attention to it. AI has the potential to displace large segments of the economy, and that's great for certain sectors, but remember, we deal with people as well, and so there's going to be potential massive unemployment. So unless we create the proper kinds of educational programs to allow for the retraining, and we've done that in the past. The GI Bill that was passed to deal with the GIs coming back from World War II, that was a very successful government program that helped to retrain a number of the young men and women that were involved. I think that we're going to have to do something at that level in order to be able to make that transition to the new economy smoother and with less of these human disruptions.
Regarding the industry shifts, so the pharmaceutical industry is already one of the most profitable industries in business. And the pandemic brought some pretty heavy attention to the importance of drug research and development. So I was wondering how you think this will impact the pharmaceutical industry overall.
Well, I think it's a complicated set of issues that you raise, and very important one. So let me address it from a couple of different perspectives. One from the pharmaceutical industry's perspective, and then one from, I think, the rest of society, because those are not necessarily the same thing. I think that from the pharma industry's perspective, this will overall be a very positive thing, because while there may have been concerns about drug pricing and lack of innovation and so on, I think that now more than ever, we understand the value of the biopharma industry. And so I think that they're going to be definitely helped by COVID-19. On the other hand, from the public policy point of view, I think for years, we've been ignoring the problem of infectious diseases. And, I'm not pointing any fingers or blaming anybody, because obviously, there are other priorities that we as a society face. And so you can't do everything. You can't fund everything. And so although a lot of people have been warning about the potential for a pandemic and the need to deal with infectious diseases, and we still have those needs, by the way. So antibiotics is a very important area that's been neglected for far too long. I think that if there is a silver lining to COVID-19, it's that now governments will realize that they need to be more intimately involved in this particular business. And the reason that I point government out specifically is that, unlike other types of drugs like cancer drugs or heart disease, which at this point largely is a private sector affair, when you're dealing with infectious diseases, that is a public health issue. And as soon as you acknowledge it's a public health issue, governments have to be engaged. They're the ultimate customer. They're the ones that are going to be paying for these vaccines eventually. And so the policies that they follow are going to be critical in determining the future course of this industry. So up until recently, most big pharma companies have been getting out of the vaccine business because, frankly, historically, it's not been that profitable. And part of the reason for that is vaccines. You basically, take once, or maybe you get a booster shot, or in the case of the flu, influenza, maybe you take it once a year. But it's not like a cancer drug where you have to take literally every single day or week, otherwise you die. And so the profitability prior to COVID-19 was not particularly attractive. And so investors and big pharma companies were getting out of the field. With the pandemic, I think now governments realize not only do they have to pay up for these R&D efforts to get these vaccines, but they actually have to think ahead and stockpile vaccines for diseases that have yet to emerge as epidemics or pandemics. And so I think that one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that we're going to be better prepared for the next one. And so I'm hoping that governments will follow through, but we're going to have to wait and see.
My question is, during a recession, what do you feel is the best way to diversify your assets to help limit your loss, if any, during a time like this?
Well, so I guess it really depends on who you are. If you're a pension fund or an endowment or an institution, that's a very different situation than if it's just you and me, retail investors. So let me sort of talk about it from both perspectives. So from the retail investor's perspective, I think the question requires a little bit more elaboration on your personal circumstances. For example, for all of you, given your age, given your earnings potential and so on, the bottom line is that, in my view, you don't need to do anything because you got such a long time horizon that focusing on the short term, and I really do mean this as a short term, my view is that the pandemic is going to be over in another year or two, depending on how quickly we get vaccines. But the bottom line is that, you're going to be earning for many, many more years. So this is going to be a very small blip to your overall net worth. And so for you, I think the answer is don't do anything. Just do exactly what you're doing. For your parents or for your grandparents, that's a different story. If you are just about to retire, you need to manage the risk of your exposure very carefully. And so you may want to be aware of the fact that the market is going to be a roller coaster ride over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. And so if you really need the cash over the course of that time period, you may want to liquidate some of your risky holdings and put them into cash so as to be able to maintain that level of liquidity. However, that's a relatively small proportion of the population. For most of us, for your parents, for example, they're certainly going to be working for another 10 or 15 years. And once again, my view is that for the next 6 to 12 months, the stock market will be very volatile. At times, it'll go up and down depending on the news. The day that we get a vaccine approved, I bet the S&P will go up by 5 to 10%. The day that Tony Fauci gets fired, if he gets fired, I think the stock market will go down by 5 or 10%. So the market is very, very focused on what's happening with COVID-19. And so that's the roller coaster ride that if you do need the cash in that very short time frame, if you're already retired, you want to preserve your cash, you need to worry about those kind of considerations. But for most everybody else, I think we just need to be patient and ride out the ups and downs. My guess is that even if the stock market does go down by 5, 10, 15% over the next year, after we are on the other side of the pandemic, the economy, the global economy is going to grow like you would not believe. We're going to have a period of tremendous economic growth, and you don't want to miss that. You want to be able to take advantage of that.
So no industry was really unaffected by the pandemic, including the healthcare industry. So I was wondering, what are some of the likely economic impacts in healthcare specifically, both short-term and long-term? And also because of the employment shifts in the healthcare industry that the pandemic caused, do you think there will be further shifts as the country recovers?
Yeah, so that's a great point. I think there are already some tremendous shifts in the healthcare industry, and I think there'll be more to come. But you're right that all industries have been affected. Just take a look at cruise lines. Carnival Cruise got hit pretty badly because obviously, people were hit pretty hard, when they were, exposed to the coronavirus on a cruise ship. But having said that, at a lower price, people still want to take cruises. And so you can still make a very good business. So the industry is not gone by any means. But getting back to your point about the healthcare industry, so a few things to note. One of the most important aspects of biotech and pharma companies is the need for financing. Unlike many other businesses, I mean, all businesses need money to run, but there are some businesses where actually when you start the business, you get money coming in right away. For example, a subscription business. If you started some kind of an internet business where you get subscribers and you have the so-called freemium model where you give away certain services, but if you're willing to pay $1.99 per month, you get some extra services, that's a kind of business that generates cash from day one. And so from the financing point of view, I've known a number of very savvy entrepreneurs that have never taken a single dollar of venture funding because they pick businesses where it generates cash right away, and that can be used to fund the growth of your business. That's completely the opposite of the biotech industry. In the biotech business, you need a ton of money upfront all along the way to do the clinical trials from beginning to end. And so really the business of biotech for the first 5 or 10 years of your existence is raising money and spending money. It's only when you get a drug approved that you actually are able to start getting cash flows, apart from milestones and other kinds of licensing deals. And so it's a very different business model. It is a very cash-dependent business model. You need cash all along the way. What has happened during COVID-19 is a disruption in that cash flow. Now, it turns out that investors have a lot of money, and much of that is waiting on the sidelines for the right opportunities. But the traditional methods of funding have been disrupted. And so a number of biotech companies have run into trouble because they need financing, and the usual investors are not immediately available because they're worried about their own portfolio companies needing cash. So there's been a disruption. That disruption is leading to new methods of financing and new business models that can deal with financial risks a little bit more efficiently. So I think what we're going to see over the course of the next 2 or 3 years is a variety of new forms of financing, including loans and other kinds of debt-structured securities that will allow biotech companies to be able to access capital in a somewhat more efficient and more consistent manner than just simply hoping that they can do an IPO. The IPO market has been pretty good for biotech over the course of the last few months, and certainly throughout the pandemic. I expect that the biotech IPO market has been the strongest among all of the different industries. But those are for companies that are relatively mature. For the early stage biotech companies that are just getting off the ground, or those that haven't yet launched but want to launch, they've faced some really, really tough challenges over the last few months. So I suspect that we're going to see all sorts of financial innovations and new business models over the course of the next year or two to be able to address those kinds of disruptions and challenges.
Due to the recession making many small-scale medical device providers go under or out of business, how do you feel is the best way for economists to advise policymakers against allowing monopolistic prices and quantities from happening, which many medical sales devices and pharmaceuticals are already so expensive and might be taking people out of the business and getting those to the common people?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there are all sorts of challenges that come with the industry in a period like this. And consolidation, which is one of the things that you mentioned, is a fact of biomedical life. It's very often the bigger fish that are eating the smaller fish simply because the smaller fish are having a harder and harder time competing. That's actually something that's been happening across all industries in various different forms. And so this kind of industrial shift is nothing new. In fact, I think it's actually healthy in that you're actually getting more efficient economic outcomes. But at the same point, you also raise another key insight, which is that the bigger you are, the more you're likely to engage in what economists call monopolistic competition. The idea that because you're the 800-pound gorilla, you get to set prices, you get to set your own terms, and very often you produce outcomes that are not as efficient from the consumer's perspective. So that's one of the reasons why the Department of Justice has an antitrust division to make sure that we don't have situations where there's overly monopolistic markets. But this gets at I think, a much deeper point about how the economy works. And that is, the economy is much more like a biological ecosystem rather than a physical system. In other words, we don't have just a few equations that generate all the laws of motion in our field. What's going on is that you've got a very complex set of different species that are competing for resources, and in some cases collaborating, and in other cases competing in a zero-sum game kind of a perspective. So it's important to understand what that kind of a landscape is. And so to your point about medical device companies, but I think it really applies more broadly to biotech and pharma, we are seeing consolidation during this period. What can policymakers do to encourage more innovation? And that really has to do with making it easier to start companies. Figuring out how to get those of you who are in school right now to start dreaming big about what you're going to do when you graduate, how you're going to start your own business and be able to fund it in a way that will allow you to take your own best shot. And ultimately, the more shots on goal, to use a hockey or a soccer term, the more likely it is we're going to see some really incredible businesses emerge. That's how Facebook emerged. That's how Microsoft emerged. They were all shots in the dark by college kids who thought that they could change the world. What we want to do is to encourage that. And I think that this combination of the Ford Institute, the Gerstacker Institute, the Wilson Institute is like the perfect combination. You've got the policy, the business, and the science coming together. That's what we need more of. And if the government can actually provide that kind of support at the college and graduate school level to excite and encourage young entrepreneurs, I think we're going to see that kind of innovation lasting for decades.
Andrew, we have a question from the audience about novel funding mechanisms. Before we continue with the students, let me share this with you.
Sure.
Have any mutual fund companies set up a mutual fund that provides venture capital for rare disease therapeutics?
Wonderful question. I wish I could say the answer is yes. Not yet. I'm hopeful that we will have that soon. Because I think the real power of crowdsourcing is to basically be able to tap into the retail investment market. You're absolutely right. It's a wonderful idea. I've actually explored this with a number of mutual fund complexes, both for rare diseases and for cancer. If you can imagine the number of people that would be willing to invest, $100 or $1,000 of their IRA or 401k in a mutual company focused on early stage cancer drugs or rare disease drugs, where we could raise many billions of dollars if we had that kind of structure. So not yet, but soon, I hope. Great. All right, we'll move on with John. You got a question?
So my question, with an election coming up and politicians already looking to take action by approving a second stimulus package, what would a second stimulus package realistically look like to you?
Well, so that's a very difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure that I have the answer, but I'll certainly tell you what my opinion is at this point. I think that stimulating the economy is a two-edged sword. We have to be very careful, because sometimes if you overstimulate the economy, it's very much like overstimulating a patient that is undergoing some kind of a heart attack. You can stimulate the patient and restart the heart or somehow resuscitate the patient, but you can also do a lot of damage if you go overboard. And so the question is, what stimulus is needed, how much, and where? And I think from most economists' point of view, the key areas of stimulus really have to do with the productive parts of the economy. In other words, what you want to be able to do is to make sure that you restart businesses and you provide for people who are hurting, rather than being too broad-based about giving money out to everybody and anybody that happens to ask for it. I think that's the key. You want to first identify where the biggest needs are. Certainly in the healthcare space, you want to do what you can to deal with the public health issue. That's the ultimate cause of the current crisis that we're in. We don't have a financial crisis. We don't have an economic crisis. We have a public health crisis that has implications for finance and economics. So first and foremost, I would use whatever resources are necessary to deal with the public health crisis, to deal with COVID-19. Assuming that you've done that, what you want to be able to do is to get the economy restarted. You want to be able to deal with the businesses that are unable to withstand these kind of issues. But there are certain businesses that need to go out of business because they are not structured in the most efficient way. So you need to be able to identify between businesses that are really just having a difficult time because of short-term liquidity needs versus other businesses that are simply not as competitive, and they actually should be going out of business to make way for other businesses. So the stimulus package requires a fair amount of thought in terms of going through the entire economy and trying to understand where the stimulus is going to do the most good. Broadly speaking, as an economist, I would say that investment tax credits, where you encourage companies to make investments in the future and increase the productive capacity of the economy, those are where you're going to have the most lasting value. Giving money to consumers is a kind of a short-term fix. It doesn't necessarily help create new opportunities, because as a consumer, if I give you a bunch of money right now and you don't actually need the money, you'll just put it away and save it. What you want is for investors to invest it in the productive capacity of the economy. And so being careful about how you implement the stimulus is really critical.
Yeah, for further pertaining to that, Dr. Lowe, how could you see, like, as a young voter, how could you see each part could be, and obviously you and I, as you alluded to earlier, can see no end to this virus within minimum the next 2 months. So how could you see each party potentially varying their methods on stimulus, and what ramifications may or may that not have?
Well, I think that a systematic analysis of where the stimulus is most needed is probably in order. We haven't done that yet. One of the things that we did in the 2008 financial crisis is that policymakers did a very exhaustive analysis of where the real problems were in the economy. And so a number of institutions were identified, AIG, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. A number of the troubled institutions were immediately identified and dealt with, but then the ramifications for employment, for savings, for job creation, all of those were addressed as well. We haven't done the same type of systematic analysis, so I believe that both parties should really be focused on that. Let's try to understand from the expert's perspective where the problems are greatest, and let's try to make sure that we deal with those problems first and foremost. We need to do a kind of a triage of all of the issues that have arisen. And until we do that, we're flying blind. So certainly, even though I've spent a fair bit of my career studying economics and the financial system, to this day, I don't actually know where the biggest needs are right now in this country, because we haven't done a systematic analysis. There's no roadmap that tells us that, gee, it's the manufacturing industry that's really hardest hit. No, it's actually retail. I think you can guess by looking at the stock market performance of these different industries, which industries are hurting the most. But that's a very different question than which industries require policy intervention. As I mentioned, the cruise industry has been repriced because people feel that we're going to have to make some serious changes before people are willing to get back on cruises. But that's an industry that has already been repriced, and I'm told that the number of people signing up for cruises in 2021 actually exceeds the number that signed up for 2020 prior to COVID-19. So, even though the industry has been hit hard, the fact that it's been repriced means that it will actually do just fine under the new terms. We need to do that same analysis to see whether or not there are individuals and certain businesses that are not going to make it, and where they really need to have the kind of support of policy interventions.
John, I think you had a question.
Yeah, so in 5 ways to stabilize the COVID-19 economy, a solution offered is to partner with other countries to improve banking regulations and coordinated policy. What would some of the countries that the United States could possibly partner with to help do this?
That's a great question. And, it very much follows the kind of scientific collaborations that we've seen in COVID-19. The reasons that we've been able to deal with the virus, in the way that we have, the way that we've been able to get all of these vaccines into clinical trials so quickly is because of scientific collaboration across geopolitical boundaries. And if we could do the same thing from an economic perspective, I actually think that would provide some tremendous value for the global economy. So I think the answer is pretty straightforward. We need to collaborate with both China and Europe and other parts of the world that have large economies that have been hit by COVID-19 to come up with sensible policies that are fair and equitable to all parties concerned. Now, that's easier than it sounds, or it's harder than it sounds, because fair and equitable is not an easy thing to come up with when you're dealing with different countries. As you know, we're in the midst of a trade war with China. And there's a big history of issues regarding the two countries, and fairness and equity have been challenged at various different levels. I don't know what the right answer is, because this is not just an economic question, it's a political, social, and cultural question. But I can tell you from a purely economic perspective, trade wars help nobody. Everybody loses in a trade war from an economic perspective. And so if we can figure out the politics, if we can figure out how to get along, then I think clearly coming up with a way to collaborate with our biggest trading partner today, which is China, is, I think, going to be key to a very healthy recovery for both countries. I think both countries have suffered because of the trade war. And so if we can figure out the important political issues, I think that the economic answer is pretty straightforward.
I actually have one more question. We haven't really seen such consistent economic growth as we have from 2009 until now, or something along those lines. But since the 50s, the U.S. economy has told us that it is somewhat cyclical. And what effect do you see the coronavirus having on the next recession, whenever it may come, which it would make sense that it would be coming somewhat soon. So in your perspective, when do you see it coming, and what effect has the coronavirus had on it?
Well, I have to be careful on how to answer that question, because I think it was Paul Samuelson that said that economists have predicted 5 out of the last 3 recessions. And so I want to be careful not to be predicting things that will never happen. Let me tell you, though, what my perspective is on how I think about the cyclicality of the economy. And this gets back to a point that I made earlier, which is that I think we're actually looking at a period of great economic growth. So I look at financial markets and more broadly speaking, the economy from this kind of evolutionary biology / ecology perspective. And I wrote about this in the book that I published a few years ago called Adaptive Markets. The basic idea behind adaptive markets is that we are living in a very complex, nonlinear ecosystem of multiple species. And by species, I don't mean actual biological species, I mean economic species. We've got hedge funds, mutual funds, pension funds, non-financial corporations, policymakers, and so on and so forth. If we look at how that ecosystem fits together, we notice something kind of interesting. Over the vast expanse of decades, you have these cycles, feast and famine. And the question that that I've been asking for a long time now is why? Why do we have these kinds of cycles? And it has to do with the fact that human nature, coupled with free enterprise, means that we're going to be engaged in cycles of innovation and self-correction. So a good example is the so-called internet bubble that happened right around the late 90s and early 2000s. You remember the dot-com bust, the boom and bust, where anything named .com you could sell for a tremendous value, and then eventually it all came crashing down, with the exception of some of the big winners like eBay, Amazon, Facebook, and so on. So what's going on there is that when we get an interesting idea, we put money into it. And if that idea is good, then a number of companies succeed, grow, and make a lot of money. Investors get rich, they get very excited. That causes other people to get into the space. More money comes in, and more investments are made. And pretty soon the industry grows to such a point where it is not sustainable. And then there's a crash, and people get freaked out. They pull their money out, and you get a recession, and then it starts all over again. The important thing to know about this process is that when a recession happens, that's actually a very positive thing from a business perspective, because what's happening is an evolutionary winnowing process where the weakest get removed from the economy, and eventually the strongest survive. This is the survival of the fittest, I guess, from an evolutionary perspective. You know, evolutionary biologists and ecologists have come up with this notion of punctuated equilibria, where after a cataclysmic event that changes the environment, lots of species are wiped out, but that's a good thing for new species to come to the fore and emerge and be able to fill the niches that have been left over by the extinct species. What happened in 2008 was an extinction event among a number of different large financial institutions. Lehman Brothers, gone. Merrill Lynch, gone. Bear Stearns, gone. And so in its wake emerged a number of very successful fintech companies. So the whole area of fintech really came about after 2008. What we're seeing today is another winnowing process, a process by which a number of companies that cannot withstand 18 months of COVID-19 are going to go out of business. The businesses that do survive and the new businesses that emerge will be that much stronger. And so I believe that in 2021, over the course of the next decade, you're going to see tremendous innovation and tremendous economic growth, in much the same way that we saw what happened after the influenza pandemic of 1918. That was a pandemic that took the lives of 650,000 Americans and 20 to 50 million people around the world. But in the wake of 1918 to 1920, you had tremendous economic growth. In this country, we actually had a term for that. If you're too young to remember this, but it's called the Roaring '20s. The Roaring '20s was a period of tremendous expansion, so much so that it actually led to the excesses that caused the 1929 crash. So your point is well taken. There is going to be a reckoning, but the reckoning is not going to happen, in my opinion, for another 7 to 10 years. And then we may be looking at the great crash of 2030, but it's probably going to take that long.
So why don't we, I think I'll give the last question to Kurt, and then we'll ask Professor Lowe to sum up.
My last question is, for young professionals going into the fields of financial marketing, accounting, and so on and so forth, what is the best advice that you can give all of us here?
Well, thank you for asking that question. That's a great way to end this hour. And I was hoping to say something about it anyway, so glad to have the opportunity. First, I want to mention that you all are the future of the industries that you're interested in. And I don't say that to flatter you. This is simply a biological fact. You are going to grow into the leaders of the next generation. And so this is an opportunity for you to make an impact. And I think that there are a number of pieces of advice that I might be able to give you, but I'm not sure that I'm really qualified since I'm learning still myself. So I'll tell you what has worked for me, and that may be something that you'll find useful. And that is that there's tremendous value in any endeavor that you undertake if you are passionate about it. So rather than trying to pick an industry, whether it's healthcare or manufacturing or technology, rather than picking an industry based upon the economic opportunities that you think will be there in 3 to 5 years, I would encourage all of you to just be really excited about whatever it is that you're doing. Do what you love. Because if you do that, then what I'm going to bet is that you'll be thinking about it during the daytime, during the evenings, weekends, while you're in the shower, while you're at the movies. You're going to be thinking about it all the time. And that means that somebody else who's competing with you that isn't as interested, isn't as passionate, is simply not going to be able to put in the hours that you do. Irrespective of IQ and natural abilities, you're just going to be putting in more hours than anybody else. And at your stage, you got a lot of hours that you can do these amazing things. So find the thing that you're most passionate about. If it's building a business, great. If it's working at a big pharma company, great. If it's working for public policy, for the nonprofit sector, great. But whatever it is you do, make sure you love it. And if you do, I have no doubt that you're all going to be fantastic successes in these endeavors.
Great. Well, this comes to the end of the hour, and Andrew, want to really thank you for spending the time with our students and our community and all those that are going to be watching this. And again, thank the students for participating in this, and I hope everyone has a great evening. I guess there's some fireworks occurring later this evening that we may all tune into, and I hope everything works out for us. So anyway, thanks again, Andrew, and look forward to talking to you again at some time.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. I want to thank all of the students for your time and effort, the great questions, and you obviously did your homework. I very much appreciate it. I wish you great success. And I want to thank Albion College for hosting this. And Dr. Wilson, thank you for inviting me. And on behalf of all patients and their family and friends around the world, thank you for doing what you've done for all of us.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.
Thank you.